Okay, so now we will pursue in the main extensions of Bayesian inference. So now, just as a quick recap, we have a prior posterior analysis that we can see and describe how the data likelihood has impacted our prior distribution into making a posterior distribution. We can have now the point estimates and expected values, for example, a median, but also the highest density intervals, and also we can have bias factors that are analogous of a p-value but richer and more intuitive to interpret. So now we will dive into sequential analysis and robustness analysis with a really cool concept that is called the Bayesian update. Okay, so there's a property in Bayesian inference that is really cool, that is basically it is robust to multiple comparisons. So as you can see here, the type 1 error gets inflated in p-values as you can get more samples in that. However, type 1 error inflation becomes very stable with bias factors. In other parts of the Bayesian inference, it is basically no inflation at all. So as you can see here, assuming just a little bit of type 1 error inflation, you can work with multiple comparisons, which is a pretty thing to do, or a pretty cool thing to have. This is also called data ordered invariance. So this leads to the concept of Bayesian update. The Bayesian update is like this. If we have new data, we can, from previous one, the hash or the prime, we can update our beliefs or priors using the previous data. So we can use the probability of the parameter being true given our data to the probability of our parameter being true given the new data and the previous data. So posteriors are normally not influenced by which data is included first due to being independent from them. In some models, this can be broken, but normally it's not the case. Here's a demonstration of how applying bias rules and assumption of independence you can get from this place to this place. So the probability of getting a certain parameter under or given the new data and the previous data is basically the same as the first data and the new data. Okay, so thanks to these data ordered invariance, we can assume without major issues new data for an experiment without type 1 error inflation. We can use the posteriors of a past inference as priors of the current one. This allows for these two things, sequential analysis and robustness analysis. Sequential analysis is observe how an index that we care, for example, bias factors or a highest density interval, an expected value, etc., change as new data is included. This can be done between data sets, for example, replication studies, meta-analysis, different samples within the same study, posterior studies in literature or previous literature, etc. Or you can do that, and this is very interesting, within data. For example, including row after row, observation after observation, and see how this Bayes factor changes. So you can see here in this plot how the bias factor, as you are introducing row after row, is changing and diminishing and getting into more or less 1 out of 30 and 1 out of 10. That is pretty strong evidence for H0. This allows for a lot of things. For example, check the stability of the sample, potential confounders if we sort the sample within the levels of our confounder variable, check for the replicability for studies and see how stable is this pattern of change, etc. So sequential analysis is very informative for the stability of our inference. And the other thing is called robustness analysis. This is more or less the same. See how our index changes, but instead of introducing new data, we will just change the prior. We will change, for example, one parameter of the prior, normally the equivalent or the analogous of the dispersion, variance or whatever, to see how this bias factor or whatever we want changes from super informative priors that are priors with very low variance to very non-informative priors that are priors with a really high variance or maybe infinite variance. Okay, so a useful technique to do this is basically having a control set of priors. For example, assuming the same prior for all of these models and choosing only one parameter to change, the parameter of variance or whatever, and then plot which are all of the possible values of the prior and see how the bias factor changes. And you can see, as you can see here, we have the used prior, the prior that we use in this position, that is more or less a bias factor of 4 point something. Then we have the maximum of all of the function bias factor, that is a bias factor of 5. But we also have a wide prior that is a non-informative prior, a prior with much larger variance, and a super wide prior, that is a prior with an enormous amount of variance. So as you can see here, more or less for almost all of the values possible in the prior, the bias factor is around 3 and 4, which is kind of robust because it shows little variability. The only thing that is happening that is steep is that if you change for a super informative prior, then, for example, a variance near 0 or 0.1 or something like that, the bias factor is going to decline and to just reach 1. Okay, so as you can see here, we can test the robustness of our inference and see how these bias factors are stable to changes in data and also changes in the prior. Here's a quick example of how we can do that, and here's a Bayesian t-test that we will have a screen in detail later. And as you can see here, we have a prior and posterior, so with a high impact on the data likelihood. We have the estimate, the median of 0.22 for the effect size, the 95% credible interval or high density interval. We have a bias factor of 3010, which is extreme evidence favoring H1. We have the pizza plot here. And also we have the sequential analysis, as you can see here, how sample is being introduced. It has some ups and downs, but it's increasing constantly as the general pattern. So it seems that our dataset is more or less stable. Maybe these ups and downs reflect a potential confound, but it's not much of a big deal. And now in the robustness analysis, you can see here that even making a super extremely informative prior, the bias factor, the smallest bias factor that you can obtain is basically around 50. And then it has an enormous increase to a maximum of 5,000. And now, as you can see here, if you start to change the variance of the prior, you can get to the level we specified, that is 3,000, a wide prior of 2,000, and a super wide prior of 1,000. So everything is more or less in the same range of values, extreme evidence towards H1. So as you can see here, this is a robust inference regarding the width of the prior, the dispersion of the prior, the informative or non-informativeness of the prior, and also our sample. So we can trust this prior posterior bias factor and credible interval as something that is kind of reliable. Okay, so this is Bayesian inference in a nutshell with all of the specific parts, and as you can see here, it has been easier than expected. And now this is the end of session 2, and we will see each other in some simple tutorials. And now we see you in the third session. Thank you.